All right, so I'm going to try to take it up a level, and I really want to thank Tim for inviting me here. I'm a couple years into the culture thing, and Edgar, I've read your books, and I'm continuing to follow everything you say, and I'm learning as fast as I can. So I'm going to give you some perspective on why culture is so important, and actually, I think it is changing. I think I have a little bit more of a positive outlook on what's happening out there, and that the rugged individual model of culture in the United States is changing, and I think organizational culture is changing, and I think companies like Google are actually forcing that and creating role models for many of you, and I'm going to give you some context for that. So stay tuned for a couple of minutes here. I'm going to go through some, a fair amount of material in half an hour. And then later at the end, we can answer questions independently, and you get access to the slides. So first of all, I'm going to go through 5 keys to culture. But before I do that, why are we talking about it all the time? Why is it trending up in Google? Why are all the articles written about it? I think it's because your organizations are all going through disruptions. I do a lot of research in Deloitte. I'm the co-leader of the Global Human Capital Trends Study. I'll show you the data on that. We've seen what's going on out there. I generally meet with CHROs and business executives, and they all tell me, whether they're in retail, manufacturing, healthcare, technology, financial services, we are being disrupted by somebody. Another company, a small company, a startup, a crowd, a bunch of people that we don't really know how they got to where we are. We have young people in the organization that have different needs and different demands than the older people did. We have technology challenges in our products and services. We need to reinvent them for the digital world. Things are happening faster than we realized they were going to happen. And by the way, our employees don't really belong to us anymore. They're kind of working here for a while, but they're looking around, and a lot of them, just disappear when we don't take good care of them. And that's not the way it used to be. And I'm actually almost 61, so I've been around for a while. I've been working for over 30 years, and I came to work in the old days when you went to work for one company your whole life, and that was pretty much the way I was raised, and that's not the way it works. Now, we did some research with MIT last year, and we're doing it again this year, and we had 1,000 CEOs respond to this survey, and 90% of them said that their business model is being disrupted by some form of digital disruptor. 70% of them also said, I don't have the right people in the company, I don't have the right leaders, and I don't have the right skills. So this is a bit of a crisis going on in big companies, and certainly big ones. I think smaller companies like Matt I think left, but Matt's story is a little bit different for a smaller company. And added to that is this big topic of income inequality and robotics and the future of work, quote unquote. And I've been doing a lot of research on the future of work, and let me just give you 1 minute on that. Yes, AI and technology is advancing at an incredibly rapid pace. I don't think this is a new thing. I've seen it, since the 1970s, but it is new in many ways. Computers can listen to your voice. They can understand what you say. That phone that you're sitting on or carrying around with you has 9 sensors in it. It can listen to your voice. It knows the temperature. It can measure acceleration. It can measure humidity. Some of them can measure your altitude. So these devices are getting very, very intelligent, and they're doing things that we never thought they could do before. Let me give you an example of that. One of the hottest technology areas is called farm tech. These devices now, companies like John Deere can fly a drone over a field, identify the pattern of the dirt, send the tractor out to plow the field based on the actual geography of the dirt, plant the seeds in exactly the right place using sensors, water the seeds with precisely the amount of water, go back and watch the seeds visually with devices to see which ones are growing, fertilize the ones that need help, pick the fruit when it's ready on each particular plant, and then harvest it with almost no human intervention. And this is production technology that's going on in the farming industry. And of course, we're reading stories every day about more and more of this technology entering our workforce in every job we have. In fact, if you look at some interesting data, and this is a little bit frightening for all of us, if you look at what's happened to jobs, there have been basically 4 industrial revolutions. There was the invention of indoor plumbing, there was the invention of electricity, there was the invention of the automobile, and then there was the computer, and now there's the revolution of AI. And this new wave of technology is doing away with some very important jobs. In fact, the latest wave of technology, the one that we're just in the middle of witnessing right now, is starting to do away with jobs like sales jobs. and managerial roles, and pushing towards more and more service people, human-oriented roles in organizations. And so one of the reasons that I think culture is so important is that more and more of the jobs of the future are essentially human jobs. We did a study in Deloitte, UK, that looked at and you've probably seen the Oxford University study that 47% of jobs are going away in the next 20 years. That doesn't mean the number of jobs are going away. It just means they're changing. In fact, the interesting story on that, let me just give you one piece of information there. In the 1970s and the 1980s, when the ATM machine was invented, there were stories written about the fact that we wouldn't need branches, we wouldn't need bank tellers, all the branch banks would go away. Well, it turns out there are almost 5 times as many bank branches now as there were when the ATM was launched, and there are actually 10% more tellers than there were when the ATM was launched. But they're doing different things. Now they're selling you things, obviously maybe not in a healthy way, but that's what they're supposed to be doing. They're taking care of you, and you go to the ATM, you put your money in the bank, and then you walk into the bank to get help by a human being. So jobs are becoming more human, and we're beginning to understand that listening and empathy and communication skills are the roles that we need for the future. And so your companies are around you are trying to figure out how to adapt to this and becoming more of a human organization. The one example I'll give on that one that I like to think about just myself is think about Starbucks. And this is just an example. I'm not referring to Starbucks' strategy. Starbucks could easily put robots in the stores to take your order, listen to your voice, manufacture the coffee, and you could walk right out with it probably in 1 minute. But you would lose the experience of talking to the barista, smelling the coffee, getting that coffee cup with your little name on it that's just made for you, that makes it such an incredible experience. That's what's going on in the world of work, and that's one of the reasons that I think culture is becoming a very, very strategic part of business. Now, we have a lot of data on this, and let me share a couple of things on the data. 7,000 people responded to this survey last year. We're doing the 2017 one right now. The number one challenge companies told us, 92% of them said, we're not organized correctly to succeed. That's basically every company, right? I mean, that's like almost every one of them. And then we asked them, do you know how you should be organized to succeed? And only 14% of them said they had any idea. So what's going on in companies, and I think we heard a little bit about this from Google, is the idea of the corporate hierarchy and the idea of the org chart and the top-down leadership. It's gone. It's going away. Even though it looks like the picture on the left, and you have leaders that are acting like it's the picture on the left, and you have reward systems designed for the picture on the left, the company is running like the picture on the right. That's the way people actually work. We as human, and I've done some research on this, it's very interesting. A couple of little sort of psychological studies I looked at. Number one, the human brain can only accommodate about 100 human relationships. So we have about, at most, 100 close friends. So when you work in a big company with tens of thousands of people, you don't really know all of those people. You only know a small group. So you tend to gravitate towards a small group. Companies like W.L. Gore, for example, split their business units into 100-people groups because they know that about 100 people is the optimal size. And you've probably read the story from Jeff Bezos when he walks into a conference room and he says, if there's more than 2 pizzas for lunch, the team is too big. This idea of a small team really works. Now, the second piece of information that I think helps understand that is another piece of research done by MIT, where some researchers found that if you look at the pattern of communications inside your company, you will spend 2 orders of magnitude more time with people that are within 50 meters of your desk than people that are far away. Because we like to walk around and talk to each other and walk on the whiteboard and have a conversation face to face. And that's why I believe companies like Google and Facebook and many, many other companies have created these big campuses to bring people together so that these teams can foster and communicate well. However, the one problem with this organization that we're becoming, and this is the way, and I've talked to many, many companies about this today, is that if these teams don't talk to each other, if they don't share values, if they don't understand what each other are working on, they will actually compete with each other. And the best example of that, many stories have been written about this, is the story of the iPod. Most of you probably know, if you're my age, that the electronic music player was actually invented by Sony. And it was the Walkman. It was a very, very successful product, long before Apple was even in the market. And Sony had digital music, had dozens of different digital music players. But they were all in small groups run by different R&D teams, none of whom were talking to each other. And no one really realized that this would become an ecosystem of solutions, of songs, of publishers, of software. And so it never really came to market. Apple, of course, figured that out, created this incredible, ecosystem of music, which then later turned into many, many other products and services. And so this problem of having teams communicate with each other is a big, big issue in organizations. And I think one of the biggest reasons that culture is so important and why your job is so important and why you have to get, obviously, the CEO involved is if you don't have a common shared culture that's well communicated, these teams will not work together. They will not know what they could or couldn't do with each other. And we have research to prove that. One more example. We had the head of talent from GM speak at our research conference in May, and he told me that they did a study of the highest performing product introductions at GM, and they looked at the ones that failed, and they looked at all of the characteristics of those teams. Were they smarter? Were they more tenured? Were there more engineers? Was there better leadership? Was there less leadership? What was different about them? And he said the only thing we could uncover that was a predictive trait of these high-performing teams is they were very, very well connected inside of GM. They knew what other people were doing. They had a lot of relationships. They understood the dealer network. They understood the sales network. They understood the manufacturing process. And so they built stuff that would succeed in the GM ecosystem. And so, again, that's a very much of a cultural thing of connecting people together. My experience at Deloitte, by the way, just let me give you one quick one on that. I got parachuted into Deloitte 3 years ago through an acquisition, and I had no idea what I was in for. And I'm now a part of an organization that has 275,000 people and no org chart. You will not find it. It doesn't exist. Everything works on relationships and on networks. And so it can be done in a large organization. And Deloitte is an incredibly well-run, high-performing organization. So you don't have to create this organization chart and drive it down necessarily to be successful. The second reason that I think culture is really important is this one. Whether we like it or not, we have been given addictive drugs by our technology providers. The phones, the software we have, I don't want to get in trouble by mentioning any company names, but we are all a little bit overwhelmed at work. I have been in the working world since 1978. I've been here before email. I was here before the PC. I've watched all this happen. We're all just a little bit out of control. I was sitting at our table over here. My partner at the table was doing her email during some of the presentations. And you can see it's affecting us personally. I think the saddest part of this data to me is that 40% of people think they can't have a reasonable family life and a reasonable career. And that's an indication of how bad this has become. Also, to make it worse, we have not improved productivity. So all these great tools, thank you, that we've gotten, all this technology has not necessarily made us more productive. We've done research on this. We wrote a whole piece 2 years ago called The Overwhelmed Employee. It was the second or third most frequently read piece on the Deloitte University website. And this is why. We're not sure how to use all this stuff yet. So your employees, to some degree, are struggling to figure out how to get their jobs done in a meaningful way with a flood of emails, messages, Skype, whatever it is that technology is that you're using. This week, Facebook announced another tool set that I know a lot of you will probably use. So this is not ending. And that, of course, leads us to this issue of how do people get along and relate at work, which gets to the issue of, I guess you guys would call it, you culture people would call it climate. I would call it engagement. So let me tell you a little bit about what I've learned about engagement. Engagement, as best I can tell, has not gone up for the last 20 or 30 years. Look at the Gallup data. Look at all the data you looked at. This is data directly from Glassdoor. This is employees' personal opinions of their companies. It's almost a perfect bell curve. And for the 5 years that I've looked at it, it's stayed the same. So despite the wonderful things that Google has done and all these incredible companies out here in California, we're still kind of not that good at this. Yet there are some companies that are. And if you look at these companies on the right, you kind of ask yourself, what is it about them that's different? So I've sliced the data and I've looked at it. Are they tech companies? Are they small companies? Are they young companies? Are they companies in a particular industry? What's unique about them? And there's actually no patterns whatsoever. There isn't, I've looked at it statistically. The only thing that is different about these companies is their leadership. The way they treat their people, the way they think about their people, the investment they made in their people. I was at the Workday Rising conference about 3 weeks ago, and Dave Duffield got up, and you all know who Dave Duffield is, very, very successful guy. He said, you know, at Workday, our strategy is employees first, a little bit before our customers. He said that in front of 7,000 customers. I mean, and that's the way they treat that company. And that's one of the things that I think you have to think about in the world of culture. It's great to put customers first, but we really can't deliver for customers unless we're taking care of our people. So that's why I think culture is so important. And by the way, you don't have to be a tech company. You don't have to have a lot of analytics. You don't have a lot of technology to build a great culture. This company wins the award for the best place to work month after month, year after year after year. It's called Quicken Loans. It's a mortgage broker, and it's in Detroit. And they're a great company, and it has an incredible culture, and they don't use a lot of high tech to do that. So that's my message there. Okay, so let me get to this, because I got, 10 more minutes? 9 more minutes. All right. Okay, so what does this all mean to you? Let me give you sort of 5 big trends that I think are really driving culture today. And I'm not going to get into the details of how you measure it and how the different tools work, because you're all experts on that. And these are the 5 things that I think are critical things that are changing in the corporate culture. Learning, purpose, inclusion, feedback, and leadership. Let me talk about learning first. We are becoming a service economy around the world, thanks to technology and robots and everything else. As John Hagel, one of our researchers in Deloitte, calls it, companies are moving from scalable efficiency to scalable learning. It's great if you can produce your product and service fast and cheap and get it in front of customers, but you've got to be learning at the same speed because somebody else is copying what you're doing and taking your margin away. So learning is critical. It is also critical to the individuals in your company. We as human beings now realize, most of us know, that if we're not keeping ahead in our domain, whatever it is, we are losing money. We are actually falling behind economically. Lots of research has been done on this. The lifetime or the life cycle of skills in most jobs is a year or 2. If you worked in digital marketing 2 years ago and left the workforce and came back today, you would barely know what's going on. That's true in software. That's true in almost every domain we live in. So learning is a critical issue. Companies know this. People know this. If you look at employment brand, take the Glassdoor data and correlate whether you'd recommend your company to work against all the other things in Glassdoor. The most highly correlated issue is culture. Number 2 is leadership. Number 3 is career. 2 to 3 times higher than how much money you pay. So how much money you make is obviously important, but these other factors are even greater. If you look at millennials, learning and development is their number 1 driver of why they want to work for your company. So you have to provide a learning experience, you have to provide a learning culture, you have to create an environment of learning for your people, both for them as individuals and of course also for you as a business. And unfortunately, most young people don't feel you're doing that right now. I mean, this research came out 2 weeks ago. 7,000 or so millennials responded to this. They don't feel like they're being utilized in your organizations. And I think one of the reasons for that, frankly, is a little bit of what I would call unconscious bias on age. Those of us that are my age grew up in this world of, well, you know, you kind of pay your dues and, you know, maybe within 10 or 15 years you can have this great job. And of course, that works against this idea of rapid development and developmental assignments and quick learning for young people. And those are issues that directly affect our culture, as well as the issue that we have to make careers more dynamic in companies as well. I was with the CHRO of a large consumer products company about a month ago, and she said, the way the career works in our company, I won't mention the company name, is we have a hazing process. It's a 20-year hazing process. And if you survive the hazing process, you can become a VP too. This was only a month ago. That stuff's got to go. I mean, you can see people will not tolerate that anymore. Okay, lots of examples of that. Number 2, purpose. One of the folks mentioned one of the books on purpose. This is a huge driver of culture today. even bigger, I think, than it has been in the past. We came out of the 2008 recession. A lot of millennials can't afford to buy a house anymore. They don't want to drive a BMW. They're happy to take Uber. They don't necessarily have the same values, economic, financial values yet, perhaps they will later, that we may have at that point in time. And there is an ethos of purpose in the world, and this data shows that. These are the books that shaped my mind on it, and these are actually a little bit old books, but they're worth reading. Both of these books are both studies of purpose-driven companies. And the book Firms of Endearment, which is about a 10 or 12-year-old book, but really worth reading, did a statistical analysis of companies that define their value through purpose. And those companies were 8 times higher performing companies financially than the S&P 500. 4 times higher performing than the companies highlighted by Jim Collins in Good to Great, which was kind of the big business book when I was entering the workforce. So this has really been a proven thing. Great story on this one. Aetna. The CEO of Aetna went into the call centers at Aetna a year ago. This was published in the New York Times, actually, earlier this year. Found out that the call centers workers at Aetna could not afford Aetna insurance. They had below minimum wages. The turnover rate was about 60%. He had just had a personal accident and actually went through a revolution of sort of his own thinking about business. He went back and he raised the wages, gave them yoga classes and all sorts of benefits they didn't have before. The turnover rate plummeted, and he credits Aetna's profitability going up by 1% to 2% as a result of being more purposeful and thoughtful about his employees. So there's lots of stories there. Third one, inclusion. Let me just give you, I'm not going to go through the details of this, but let me give you a piece of data here. We do, most of you who know who we are, we do these exhaustive studies of talent issues in HR, and we interview thousands and thousands of companies. We get all this data back, and we do all this analysis. We try to figure out what are the practices that are correlating to the highest business outcomes. For 2 years, we've been doing a study of talent management. We had over 1,000 companies involved in this. We looked at companies around the world, and we correlated about 80 different practices against financial outcomes. What we found is that the highest performing companies were not necessarily good at recruiting or development or leadership development or coaching. The number one most highly correlated practice amongst those companies was what we called having an inclusive talent system. Being inclusive and dealing with issues like bias and diversity in who we hire, who we promote, who we pay, how we deal with leadership, succession, all of those issues. So this issue of inclusion and creating an environment where people can speak up. And there's some great stuff out on the internet. Google and Facebook and Apple and many companies have taken their unconscious bias programs and put them out on the internet so you can get them. You can learn how to do this. And so that's become a very critical part of culture today. Now, I happen to work in a company that's more of a conservative organization. We have groups inside Deloitte that have studied inclusion and diversity, and we've proven that teams that are gender diverse are actually safe. People feel safer. Teams that are racially diverse are more innovative. We actually have data that proves that inclusive teams have very specific business outcomes that other teams don't have. Number 4. Feedback. We heard that. It was an interesting conversation actually from Google on this. You know, the funny thing about feedback, for those of you that are a little bit, sort of my age, you know that the way organizations were originally set up was this. Once a year, you got to tell the company what you thought of them, and once a year, the company told you what they thought of you. And, in some ways, it's completely absurd that we designed our practices like this, but this is the way HR was designed until the last probably 3 or 4 years. Today, of course, that's all being unleashed. We're basically going to become like Yelp at work, where you're going to be able to Yelp everything. I actually do believe that's where it's going to go. But it'll be a very positive thing. And if you work in the employee engagement market, I know a lot of you do, you know that we have this flurry of new tools for pulse surveys, and let me just build this out. All these systems have been invented. If you go to the HR technology conferences, all these tools for surveys and feedback and liking and 5-star ratings of all these things at work are really beginning to take off. And I think this is a very, very healthy change. We have done research on this, and this is an area where we actually have done a lot of work over the last couple of years. And about 40 to 45% of companies are still doing a very traditional process of an annual engagement survey. But you don't really have any choice anymore. If you're not adopting these kinds of tools, you're probably not understanding what's going on in your organization. GE, IBM, Deloitte, Cisco have all reinvented the way people are evaluated based on this always-on feedback. Let me give you one piece of data on this one. Deloitte's a very conservative company, right? We're an audit firm, we're a tax firm, we're a consulting firm. We have completely done away with the traditional performance management process at Deloitte. At Deloitte today, at least in the consulting business, you're given a feedback form at least 4 times a year as a teammate, and you evaluate through these 8 very carefully selected questions things about your team. And people have correlated these 8 questions against the financial performance of that team and now proven that these 8 questions will predict the financial performance of that operating team. So feedback is not just about engagement. Feedback is a measure of performance. And so that has to be part of your culture too. And by the way, I think, and I'm going to get done in time, believe it or not. And by the way, feedback has to be, you have to think about feedback as a whole architecture. You're getting feedback in many, many places in your organization. You as OD people are probably responsible for many of these things. And all of that information is part of your leadership understanding where they have cultural gaps, where they have cultural needs, and where they can improve the performance of the organization. The final one I want to touch on just for a minute is leadership. Now, leadership is a strange market. 2 books came out this year, one from a professor at Stanford, one from a professor at Harvard, debunking the industry, if you've read those books. There's thousands and thousands of models and books and assessments and ideas and workshops on leadership. Everybody who's ever been a leader wants to write a book on what it's like to be a leader. And you know, it's a tough place to be. It's very challenging. I believe what's basically happening is a changed ethos of leadership. And so I see this for our data and through the people I talk to. I think we are moving to a model where the leaders that we respect, we'll see what happens with the presidential election, and I don't want to get involved in that right now, but the leaders that we respect, the leaders that are considered to be role models, are servant leaders. They are collaborative leaders. They are purposeful leaders. I think that is really happening. We still have lots of stories of traditional leadership out there, but more and more that's falling away. We did some research on this. Let me spend 1 minute on this and then I'll wrap up. Unfortunately, the leadership market is a bit of a bifurcated market. For every company that invests in leadership and understands leadership and does things like Google does, there's about another company that doesn't do anything. And this is interesting data. You can see that in the data we collect, a lot of companies really don't invest much in leadership. And when we study the maturity of leadership development organizations, there's a fair number of organizations that are doing very traditional things. So I would challenge you in your 5 areas of culture, take leadership seriously. Focus on millennials. Focus on young people. Drive leadership in education experiences and coaching down lower in the organization. Give people opportunities to take leadership roles much, much earlier in their careers. You would be surprised what they can do. Mark Zuckerberg, I think, is 31 or 32. I don't know. He's generally about that age. He's the most successful internet leader I think we've ever had, or one of them in the world. In most big companies, he probably wouldn't even been given maybe a mid-level job because of the traditional leadership pipeline. And we have to understand that the skills and capabilities of leaders today that we need are different. And let me spend just a second on this and then I'll wrap up. One of the studies that we're in the middle of rolling out is a big study of what we call digital DNA. What makes digital companies successful? And we've come up with, yes, 23 characteristics of these digital companies. And what we've found is that the leaders in these companies are actually behaving and acting in a unique way. And those are things that you can learn about and you can reinforce through your culture. So that's kind of my story. I think culture is a critically important issue in organizations for good reasons. We have to look at the 5 issues of leadership, inclusion, purpose, learning, and feedback to make it successful. And I really want to thank you all for inviting me to come speak today. I'm sorry I went a little bit over. They're kind of working here for a while, but they're looking around, and a lot of them, just disappear when we don't take good care of them. And that's not the way it used to be. And I'm actually almost 61, so I've been around for a while. I've been working for over 30 years, and I came to work in the old days when you went to work for one company your whole life, and that was pretty much the way I was raised. And that's not the way it works. Now, we did some research with MIT last year, and we're doing it again this year, and we had 1,000 CEOs respond to this survey. And 90% of them said that their business model is being disrupted by some form of digital disruptor. 70% of them also said, I don't have the right people in the company, I don't have the right leaders, and I don't have the right skills. So this is a bit of a crisis going on in big companies, and certainly big ones. I think smaller companies like Matt I think left, but Matt's story is a little bit different for a smaller company. And added to that is this big topic of income inequality and robotics and the future of work, quote unquote. And I've been doing a lot of research on the future of work. And let me just give you 1 minute on that. Yes, AI and technology is advancing at an incredibly rapid pace. I don't think this is a new thing. I've seen it, since the 1970s, but it is new in many ways. Computers can... All right, so I'm going to try to take it up a level. And I really want to thank Tim for inviting me here. I'm a couple years into the culture thing, and Edgar, I've read your books, and I'm continuing to follow everything you say, and I'm learning as fast as I can. So I'm going to give you some perspective on why culture is so important, and actually, I think it is changing. I think I have a little bit more of a positive outlook on what's happening out there, and that the rugged individual model of culture in the United States is changing, and I think organizational culture is changing, and I think companies like Google are actually forcing that and creating role models for many of you, and I'm going to give you some context for that. So stay tuned for a couple of minutes here. I'm going to go through some, a fair amount of material in half an hour. And then later at the end, we can answer questions independently, and you get access to the slides. So first of all, I'm going to go through 5 keys to culture. But before I do that, why are we talking about it all the time? Why is it trending up in Google? Why are all the articles written about it? I think it's because your organizations are all going through disruptions. I do a lot of research in Deloitte. I'm the co-leader of the Global Human Capital Trends Study. I'll show you the data on that. We've seen what's going on out there. I generally meet with CHROs and business executives, and they all tell me, whether they're in retail, manufacturing, healthcare, technology, financial services, we are being disrupted by somebody. Another company, a small company, a startup, a crowd, a bunch of people that we don't really know how they got to where we are. We have young people in the organization that have different needs and different demands than the older people did. We have technology challenges in our products and services. We need to reinvent them for the digital world. Things are happening faster than we realized they were going to happen. And by the way, our employees don't really belong to us anymore. They kind of